All right, it's me again. How are you? Today we're going to read a poem by a man named Robert Frost. He's a New England poet, lived many years ago. Poem that we are going to read is A Time to Talk. And when we talk about poetry, it can be super difficult because the opposite of poetry is prose. Prose. We read a lot of prose. We don't read a lot of poetry. Prose is with paragraphs. Frankenbeans is written prose. Probably most of the stuff you read is prose. The opposite of prose is poetry. And some people, I think, either love poetry or they hate it. It's very polarizing. There's not many people in the middle. Poetry, I don't mind. It's usually, yeah, I really like poetry, or no, I hate poetry. And the reason is because poets often use figurative language, things like similes, metaphors, which are really tough. So much of poetry is metaphor. And if you remember, metaphor is comparing two things without using like or as. Similes are a bit easier because it does use like or as, like her eyes are as pretty as the ocean. It's just one I came up with, but as is in there. It's comparing somebody's eyes with the ocean. But with a metaphor, I might say she is the ocean. And like, oh, why? Or does she have a lot of like tumultuous waves? Is she salty? With metaphor, there's so much of the unknown there. Like you have to kind of invent it yourself. Now, the good thing is there's no wrong reason. There's no wrong answer if you can somehow make it work, which is why I kind of like poetry. It's not my favorite. I like prose better, but when you read poetry, you're probably thinking really hard because the poet usually, if it's a good poem, the one we're reading today took a lot of time to make sure that each word fit perfectly. Okay. And we're going to talk about something called theme as well. Theme. That's the author's message. Like, why did they write this poem? Are they trying to give you some sort of lesson or message? Can you learn something from it? What are they trying to say with their poem? And I think Robert Frost, the reason I picked this one for our first poem is because I do think Robert Frost has a message. And I don't want to say that message today. I would rather have like a little class discussion on it. But at least give you a chance to read that poem once, twice, 3 times. That's the thing about poetry also that people might not like. You rarely understand the poem the first time you read it. It's a lot like a song. Most people will listen to a song over and over, and each time you do, you learn a little bit more. Same with poetry. But before we get into the poetry part, I would like you to learn a little bit about this guy, Robert Frost. So I would like to watch this with you, but stopping when I think there's something a little bit difficult. This is only 3 minutes. Comes from I think the Biography channel. So it's a nice little biography, but they talk about some things that we haven't talked about, but I think they can be useful for you. So let's take a listen and a look at this thing.
Robert Frost is one of the most widely read and beloved of American poets, as well as one of its greatest.
4-time Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, Robert Frost was a national celebrity, famous for writing poems about rural life using American colloquial speech.
Okay, so American rural life is the opposite of city. And they just said colloquial speech. That's meaning like how people talk, regular talk, colloquial, not very fancy. It's just like the common person, just how they talk.
Frost is well known for a few poems that he managed to lodge in everyone's head. Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, also Mending Wall, And The Road Not Taken, of course, is probably the most famous of all of his poems.
While most people associate Robert Frost with New England, he was born in San Francisco on March 26, 1874, and he moved to...
So 1874, obviously this man lived a long time ago. But yeah, when I hear Robert Frost, I think New England. I think New Hampshire mostly, but definitely New England.
New England at age 11 after the death of his father.
Frost began writing poetry in high school, where he met his future wife, Eleanor White. He briefly attended Dartmouth, then went to Harvard in 1897, but left before graduating due to illness and his wife's pregnancy.
Okay, so Dartmouth, Harvard, both schools in New England, both what's called Ivy League, so like super hard to get into, some of the best schools in the world. So, and he attended them, but didn't graduate.
After Harvard, Frost took up farming.
Right there, that seems like the quintessential, like the perfect Robert Frost poem right there. You have that rock wall. He has a couple poems about like rock walls too. And you see these throughout New England. I'm not sure if you've ever seen one, but it's basically like they're really old and they were obviously dividing lines between two neighbors, but those were the rocks that were found in the ground as they were trying to get that ground ready to live on and to farm. So most of those rock walls you see in New England now are crumbling, but it's kind of a famous thing about New England there.
During this time, he lost 2 children to influenza, and he wasn't a very good farmer. The farm did not thrive, but his work thrived.
While Frost was able to get a few poems published, he was unable to get a book published. So in 1912, he sold his farm and took his family to live in England, hoping to find better luck with publishers.
Within a few months of arriving in England, Frost found a publisher for his poems.
The first book, A Boy's Will, was reviewed rather quickly by none other than Ezra Pound, who gave it a very favorable review.
Ezra Pound, you'll probably encounter him in high school, but another really famous poet, Ezra Pound.
Shortly after World War I broke out, Frost moved back to the United States and settled in Franconia, New Hampshire, where he wrote and began his long teaching career, starting off at Amherst College.
Robert Frost was really the first bard on campus.
Okay, they just said, excuse me, they just said bard. When I hear bard, I think of William Shakespeare, but a bard is B-A-R-D, is just another way to say writer, poet, that kind of stuff.
Taught at various universities, Amherst, Michigan, Harvard, Dartmouth, Middlebury.
He moved around a lot. He was in and out of universities, and as he used to call it, barding around.
By the end of his career, Robert Frost was showered with honors. He received over 40 honorary degrees.
An honorary degree, that's what a college may give a person. They didn't graduate from there. They didn't attend school there, but an honorary degree is like, wow, you've done a lot with your life. We kind of wish you graduated from here. Here's a honorary degree. So and he, I guess he received 40 of them.
He also received the Congressional Gold Medal and 4 Pulitzer Prizes.
At the age of 86, in 1961, Robert Frost was asked to read at John Fitzgerald Kennedy's inauguration.
The land was ours before we were the land. She was our land more than 100 years before we were her people.
At the time, it was as much an honor for Kennedy as it was for Frost.
Are you like me, where you watch a lot of times movies or whatever, and I say, oh, they're not wearing masks? Is that crazy? I think that sometimes, like, oh my gosh, they're so close together. That's an old man. They got to be careful. He's 86. Yeah, the mask thing.
Robert Frost died in Boston, Massachusetts.
Look at those eyebrows. Could write great poetry, had big eyebrows.
At the age of 89 on January 29, 1963. Poetic to the end, Frost's tombstone read, "I had a lover's quarrel with the world."
When Amherst College built the Robert Frost Library, Kennedy agreed to give the keynote address, and it was one of the great speeches of his presidency. In that speech, Kennedy wrote, "When power corrupts, poetry cleanses." He was thinking very much of Robert Frost as a poet who spoke truth to power.
Robert Frost felt very strongly about form. He once famously said, "Free verse is like playing tennis without a net. It ain't tennis."
Okay. It ain't tennis. Free verse. That is a type of poetry where there are no rules. It actually looks like prose, free verse. So no rhyming, or, there might be rhyming, but there's no pattern. Free verse is, and Ellen Hopkins, if you've ever read any of her stuff, that's free verse. Looks very much like prose. So he said that, what do you say? It's like playing tennis without a net. It ain't tennis. So he was not a big fan of free verse. And when we read his poem later in this video, you'll see there is a form to it. Not always rhyming, but when you look at it, it looks like poetry. When you look at free verse, it doesn't look like poetry all the time. But there are no rules. So sometimes it might,
And Frost was tennis all the way.
All right. That's that. Let me remove that. I'm back, but I want to pull up the poem so we can read that together. Let's see. It's just a little tricky. I wish it was a little easier. But I think I can pull it up right here. So it's called A Time to Talk, a poem by Robert Frost. And this says 6th grade text level. Yeah, maybe the words are 6th grade, sure. But the message behind it and the way you read it, it's much higher than 6th grade, which is why I want to read it to you first. And I would encourage you, read it a couple times so that you can get the meaning. I don't want to say too much about, remember, theme. Is Robert Frost trying to explain something to us, make us think in a different way? Theme, I always think author's message. What's the author trying to say? And again, look at this. I'm just skimming here, but we got New England. So he's definitely well known for being from New England. Time to Talk, poem by Robert Frost. So editor's note. Sometimes these are important, sometimes they're not. Let's just look at it. Maybe it is. Robert Frost is one of America's most famous poets. He was born in 1874 and died in 1963. We knew that from the video we just watched. Frost wrote many poems about the landscape of New England, where he lived. The following poem appeared in a collection of Frost poetry titled Mountain Interval, which was published in 1960. Mountain Interval. An interval is a small period of time, usually in the middle of two things that are more important. Interval. I wouldn't call middle school an interval between elementary school and high school, but some might. It's just like a little break, a little something different in between two other similar things. All right, here we go. This is the poem. Sometimes poems are hard to read. Sometimes you need to slow down a little bit because each word in the poem is usually pretty important. When a friend calls to me from the road and slows his horse to a meaning walk, I don't stand still and look around on all the hills I haven't hoed and shout from where I am, "What is it?" No, not as there is a time to talk. I thrust my hoe in the mellow ground, blade end up, 5 feet tall, and plod. I go up to the stone wall for a friendly visit. All right. I think I read each of those words correctly. They're very important. So I think that was a little bit difficult to read. For one reason, the punctuation at the end of each line. A lot of times with poetry, when there isn't anything at the end, you keep reading. If there is a comma, you pause a little bit. It could be the end of a sentence. In prose, it would be a period all the time. Not all the time in poetry. Sometimes it's a comma, sometimes it's a question mark, sometimes it's a period, sometimes it's a comma. But if there isn't anything at the end of the line, you probably keep going. Okay. When a friend calls to me from the road and slows his horse to a meaning walk, I don't stand still and look around on all the hills I haven't hoed and shout from where I am, "What is it?" No, not as there is time to talk. I thrust my hoe in the mellow ground, blade end up and 5 feet tall, and plod. I go up to the stone wall for a friendly visit. How about plod? I should have a Google form say, hey, look up plod, because I would think most people wouldn't know plod. And if we were in the classroom right now, I would definitely stop and ask, all right, does anybody know what plod means? Of course, we can't do that. So I'll just tell you what plod means. It's a slow walk, a plodding walk. It's often described maybe after a long day, your steps are a little slower. So he plods up to see his friend. So be thinking theme. I definitely want to talk about theme later, but is Robert Frost trying to tell us something? And I don't want to say too much, but yeah, I don't want to say too much. So be thinking about it. There will be a Google form, of course. There will be a Google form about this. I will ask you some questions, but I would like to have a little bit of a class discussion just so that you're there and maybe you can bounce some ideas off of me and I can bounce some ideas off of you. But I hope this is a good start to a unit that we'll be doing on poetry and figurative language. How about that? Okay. We'll call it a session end right here.